Okay, welcome everyone to Daf Yomi 1 week at a time. This is our fourth class in Masechet Sukkah. Today we are going to review Daf 21 Chaf Aleph through 28 Kaf Chet, which was today's Daf. We have a lot of pictures today, definitely for the first half of the class. So I'm going to share my screen so everyone can see the pictures. Okay, and I will also open my chat box if anybody wants to ask any questions. Okay, so we are starting. We're starting actually at the bottom of Daf 20 because we finished the chapter last week. So we're going to start the new chapter this week. So we're at the bottom of Daf 20, and I see welcome to Helen for the first time. She's joining us live, so I hope you enjoy the live class. If you'd like, you can always type any questions in the chat box, and I try to look at it all the time. And if not, definitely at the end. Okay, here we go. So the Mishnah tells us at the bottom of Daf 20 that you cannot sleep under a bed in the Sukkah. But interestingly, there's a story of students who did sleep under the bed in a sukkah. And the question was, how could they have done that? And they bring the example of Tabi the slave. Tabi we're going to see him throughout the Talmud. He is the slave of the Rav, and he actually we'll see throughout a little bit today, but other stories as well about Tabi is he is very careful about Jewish law, even though he is not Jewish. So that's just interesting to understand. So it says, well, Tabi was allowed to sleep under the bed in the sukkah because he is a slave and not obligated in sleeping or being in the Sukkah. We're going to see that actually later on today. Okay, so the Gemara at the bottom of 20 tells us, well, if the bed is lower than 10 tefachim, again, tefach being the hand breadth. Remember, those of you who have learned Masechet Shabbat and Eruvin, 10 tefachim makes a domain. So if it's less than 10 tefachim, then it's not considered a domain or an ohel being a tent, and therefore it would be okay. But what if it is 10 tefachim? The other is, since we're talking about this ohel, which is a tent or an enclosure, the Gemara continues and talks about a hollow in a stone. And is the hollow in the stone, is that considered a tent, an ohel, for impurity? And at the top of 21, it says, well, only if it was made specifically to be this enclosure, again, a tent. But here it doesn't literally mean tent, it means a roofed over area. So the Gemara says that if something is man-made, then it has the status of a tent, an ohel, and then it would convey impurity. Just to remind us, if there is a dead body in an enclosed area, in a tent, in an ohel, so then everything in that room would become tameh. So that would become impure. So that's really what we're trying to understand. What do we call an enclosed area? And here the Gemara says at the top of 21, one idea is that it needs to be man-made. So if you were maybe in like a natural, maybe a grotto or a cave that's natural, maybe that would not convey tum'ah, impurity, the way we would think it would. Or again, another opinion is no, it does not have to be man-made, and even something natural could be seen as an enclosure. From here, of course, if we're going to talk about impurity, tum'ah, we're going to talk about the para aduma. If everybody remembers the red heifer, we did talk about this a lot when we learned Masechet Psachim. So if you remember, the red heifer was burnt and the ashes were used to sprinkle on people who had become impure from touching a dead body. Now, the people who were involved in making these ashes needed to be pure. And interestingly enough, the Gemara here on 21 describes that there were actually these courtyards that were set upon rock. And then there was a platform on top of that, and they would bring, again, it's interesting if this actually really happened or not, but they're trying to create a situation where somebody never became impure. Again, that is not something that we do need, but they're trying to be very stringent. So they say they would bring pregnant women to this area. They would give birth in this area and keep these children and raise them in this area so that the children would never become impure. They would only use stone utensils, which do not convey impurity. And when these children would go and collect the water in order to dissolve the ashes of the red heifer, they would actually sit on top of these oxen, and that would prevent them from becoming impure, lest something underneath would be impure. So here we're going to talk again that somehow the animal is protecting them, again, the airspace, from becoming impure. Another opinion is actually they put like a door or a plank of wood between them and the animal, and that would separate them from any impurity that they would ride over. So interestingly, again, here the Gemara talks about if the animal is seen, right? Again, these children are riding this animal. If the animal is seen as preventing impurity from going up, we see that that's a natural ohel, a natural tent. And we just said that maybe it needed to be man-made. So this is being brought as a source that a natural division or partition separation between a person and the dead body would be considered enough to prevent the child from becoming impure. So let's go back again to this bed. And the Gemara, and we're going to get to the bed in a minute in the next Mishnah, but we have seen this before, right? Beds are made to be slept on. What about sleeping under the bed, right? Is that considered, right? You can see here in the picture, it's pretty low, but if one wanted to sleep under the bed, would that be an issue or not, right? It's a very small space. It's not meant really to be slept there. So then maybe it wouldn't be considered an ohel, right? Again, a protective cover. Or again, maybe this bed is temporary and that is why it would be okay. And here the Gemara also adds that slaves, again, as I mentioned before, because we mentioned tabi, that slaves are exempt from sleeping. They are not obligated to sleep or eat in the Sukkah. And again, they shouldn't sleep under the bed. And we're going to leave that to the next Mishnah. Let's talk about this bed. So here you see on this picture here in front of you that if you put, so the Mishnah on Daf 21 tells us that if you put the schach, again, schach is the name of the roof of the Sukkah. If you put the reeds or the roof on top of a bed frame, as long as there are 10 tfachim, right? Again, 10 hand breadths of space underneath the roof, that would be valid. Or, says the Gemara, so you can see here, it's like a bed with a roof. Or, says the Gemara, no, the actual Sukkah needs to be able to stand on its own, right? If I pull the bed out of this Sukkah, the roof is just going to fall down. So the Gemara says that maybe, Abaye says that maybe it needs to be this way. Again, the roof can be over the bed, but it needs to be able to stand on its own. Again, we're creating a structure, and we'll see in a little bit how solid that structure needs to be. So here the Gemara says that it has to stand on its own. So again, the Gemara says it needs to have an element of permanence, or maybe because, again, the bed is holding up the roof, that would not be okay, and you need these poles on all sides. But again, if you put the roof over the bed, like you see here in this picture, picture 133, then it would be a valid sukkah. Let's go to Daf 22. Daf 22, the Mishnah tells us that if the schach, if the roof is miduvlelet, which we don't know what that means yet. We'll hold off in a minute. The Gemara is going to explain what that means. But if the roof is this word, and if there's more shade than sun, then it would be okay. It's a valid sukkah. But if it's very, very thick, though, even though you can't see the stars, it is valid. So now the Gemara needs to explain to us, what does this mean, miduvlelet? So the word means, maybe one option is that it means it's a poor sukkah. It's very sparse. So you can see here that it is, well, we're not up to this picture just yet. Well, one option is that it's very sparse. It's very, the roof is very spread out. As long as there aren't more than 3 tfachim, in between each rod, each reed, then it would be okay. Okay, Sarah just asked me about the sukkah, that's the bed. How would they be able to eat? So that's an excellent question. Interestingly enough, some people have a sleeping sukkah and an eating sukkah. I know, like, I have friends who will have their main sukkah on the main floor, but, on the balcony out of their room, they actually build a sukkah for them to sleep in. So that is an excellent question, Sarah, that it could be that this is just meant to sleep in, or it could be that they sit on their bed and they eat, even though our parents told us not to eat in bed, maybe it would be fine. You're right, though, it does need to be the minimum size of a sukkah. So excellent question. Let's go back to our sukkah, our schach, the roof, that seems to be very sparse. So here the Gemara says, picture 134 shows us, what about if the roof is staggered? Instead of it being all one line, you stagger them, one up, one down. That would be okay, says the Gemara. So maybe the word is mibulbelet, like mixed up. And therefore it means that it's like this, like on 2 different levels. The Gemara says it's fine, again, as long as there isn't more than 3 tfachim of airspace. So just to remind us, 3 tfachim, 3 handbreadths, is anything that is within 3 tfachim is seen as a closed space, meaning it's seen as all connected. So then that would be okay. And the Gemara here brings up an important concept called in Aramaic, it's called Chavot Rami. And it basically means that we see that if something is, again, within 3 tfachim of each other, we see it all as one layer. So even though here I have 1 reed up, 1 down, 1 up, 1 down, I see it as one straight roof, and that would be okay. And from here, we get into a very interesting discussion. Here you can see it from a different angle. That, again, it has to be, you see how it's like every other one. The slats are with, in the airspace of the other one. So it's as if it is a solid roof. And here, again, we'll talk about the sun that it lets in a minute. But first, the Gemara, again, we're going to go back and forth. We started from the theme of Sukkah, but we're going back to this idea of purity and impurity. So remember when we said, if there is a dead body or something that is impure and it is under a roof, everything in that room becomes impure. So now let's look at this scenario. And here, even though it looks like a bunk bed without its mattresses, this is actually a two-story house. Again, take your mind out. We're not talking about Sukka right now. Here we're talking about like a two-story house where they didn't finish the floor or the ceiling of the second floor. And there are these slats that kind of cover. And you can see here, we're going to see two different scenarios. One is where the slats are exactly above each other. If you can see here, they're really parallel. So here the Gemara says that if they're lined up, then anything under a beam would become impure, right? So again, if the impurity is under the beam, then we see that anything under that beam will become impure, right? But if it's, so you see here, now they moved it up to the second floor, the same thing. And if it's on the top, so it's on the top. So there's no roof. So that doesn't really matter. What happens if it's you see, it's not lined up. You see what I'm saying? Like the boards are in the airspace. What happens now? Now we view it as one whole roof, right? It's seen as solid because when you look up in the space, you see a board on top of you. Even if it's not on this floor, it's on the floor above. And therefore, if it's not lined up, then if the impurity is under any one of the boards, then the whole house becomes impure because it's seen as one large area. So you can see here, again, the same idea. That's only if it's here at the bottom. But if it's at the top, then it does go out and through the top. So that would be okay. Okay, the same thing here as well. Let's go on. This is a good review for those of you who have been studying from the beginning of this round of Daf Yomi. So we did impurity. Now we're going to talk about Eruvin, Masachet Eruvin. If you remember, we talked a lot about alleyways and how do we make them communal, or not communal actually, right? Private property. How do we make this domain private? And if you remember, we talked about putting a cross beam over the entrance of the alleyway, right? That cross beam is called the korah, and it has to go across the alleyway. So here the Gemara talks about, and we were talking about things on different levels, but first we're gonna talk about the other options. First, remember here we actually mentioned this I think last week, if not 2 weeks ago, that if you have two cross beams, one that comes from either side, if they're within 3 tfachim of each other, again that same idea, we see 3 tfachim as one, it's closed and we see them as attached. This would be valid. Since we're talking about cross beams, here the Gemara talks about how wide does the cross beam need to be. The Gemara says it has to be able to support a brick. So you can see here, this is a picture of a brick, and it needs to be able to support the brick. The Gemara tells us that if you have two very thin beams, if they are close enough together and they can together support the brick, then that would be considered a valid korah, a valid cross beam. And here is why we brought it. Oh, not yet. Here it also talks about if we have one above and one below. But here we're going to say that they're a little staggered. So if, again, here we talked about two being parallel to each other, that they can support the brick. The Gemara continues and says that even if they were staggered, if they are seen as if they are side by side to support the brick. So that's why we brought it here, to show you that if something is above and the other is below, as long as they're within 3, we see them as being on the same level if we need them to. So that is that concept. The next concept, interestingly enough, those of you who like physics, we talked about needing more shade than sun. What happens if we have, now just focus on the roof, what if we have equal shade to sun? Meaning you have, again, you can, I don't know, a hand breadth, a tefach of schach of roof, and then a tefach of space, and then a tefach, and right, and every other area is covered. Um, is that considered valid or not? We know that we need more shade than sun. What about equal? And the Gemara, I think, just fascinatingly understood this idea that when light comes through an area, that even, it comes down on an angle. So even though at the top it is equal, when it gets down to the bottom, it's wider, and therefore we were going to have more sun than shade, and this would not be valid. So they're showing how the space underneath becomes much wider, and therefore it would be invalid. However, again, the Gemara did tell us that if the schach is very thick, it is still valid. But if you can't see, it's interesting because we always think about being able to see the stars. I think that's something that we're used to saying, oh, let me look if I can see the stars. The Gemara seems to say that's not as much of an issue, but you do need to see some of the rays. And that's a disagreement on this daf. If it's about the rays of the sun, as long as I can see some of the rays coming through, then it would be valid. Okay, the next Mishnah is a very, I think, very exciting Mishnah in the sense that it's going to give us different places that we can put our Sukkah. And again, I would really, anybody who either lives in Israel or visits Israel, I definitely suggest going to the park called Naot Kdumim. It is a biblical, botanical, I don't even want to use the word garden because it's so large. And what they have there is actually, they take all of these Mishnayot that we've been studying and they actually build them life-size. So we talked about the haystack. So they have a haystack there. And now our Mishnah at the bottom of 22 tells us that a sukkah on top of a wagon or a ship is considered valid, even though the ship is going to move or the wagon is going to move. Remember, the last Mishnah told us that it needs to be stable or permanent in some way. So here the Mishnah is explaining to us that permanent doesn't necessarily mean staying in one place. So, if you have a flatbed truck and you want to put a sukkah on the back of that truck, that's fine. As long as that sukkah is sturdy, that is okay. So that's just fascinating. We'll talk about how sturdy it needs to be in a minute. And again, the Gemara says that you can go into it on the festival, on Yom Tov. What about putting a sukkah on the top of a tree or on a camel? This is valid. Again, the top of the tree, as long as there aren't branches above you, right? You clear the branches away. It is valid. However, you can't go into it on the festival, meaning on the first day or the last day. I guess the first day, the last day we don't sit anymore, but the first day of Sukkot, which is, again, a festival in the sense that there is a prohibition to climb trees or use animals. If you remember, we did discuss this in Masechet Shabbat and in Eruvin. Remember, we talked about putting the Eruv on a tree. Would that be okay or not? Remember, we said we're not really allowed to use a tree on Shabbat, lest you climb it and break off a branch. So the Gemara says that you can put your sukkah in the tree. You can use it for Chol HaMoed, the middle, the intermediate days, but not on the first day. Here's the next case. What about putting this sukkah in the tree? There are two walls, again, in the tree. And again, one wall is going to go all the way down, and that becomes a man-made wall, and that goes all the way to the ground. This would be valid. Again, you cannot go into it on the first day of the festival because you can't climb the tree, but you can use it the rest of the time. What about three walls? Here you see, here's another wall down here. So again, this would be man-made, and it is valid, and you can go into it on the Chag because this is really standing on its own, and it's just kind of leaning against the tree, which is just very interesting. Again, the top of 23, the Mishnah says that if you could, you don't have to, right? If you would remove the tree and the sukkah would stay there, then it would be valid to even go into on the first day of the festival. Okay, so now the Gemara tells us that there is actually a machloket. There's a difference of opinion about the ship. Remember, we said the Mishnah said that you can put a sukkah on the ship, and actually the Gemara tells us about a story with Rabbi Akiva and Rabban Gamliel, and they're on a ship. Rabbi Akiva says that it is valid. You can put the sukkah on the ship. Rabban Gamliel says it's an invalid. Why? Because it could blow away, right? If anybody's ever been out to sea, it could get very windy, and the sukkah might blow away. And he basically says that this would be seen as a very flimsy structure, and therefore it is not valid. Again, a flimsy sukkah on land is invalid. And here is the question. Does the sukkah need to be sturdy in wherever environment you are? So if you're on a ship, it needs to withstand very strong winds. Or do we say, no, the sukkah needs to withstand regular winds? If you're on a ship and there happens to be very strong wind and it blows away, okay, so it blew away. But in the meantime, as long as you can use it, it would be valid. Again, Rabbi Kiva says that it would be valid because it would withstand a regular wind. Again, the camel, the same idea. The camel, Rabbi Meir says you cannot go on it. Again, on the festival itself. Rabbi Meir says it is valid, you can use it. Rabbi Huda says it's invalid, and you cannot use it at all, because if you can't use it for the first day, then you shouldn't be able to use it the rest of the holiday. So please do not build your sukkah on your pet camel. Okay, the next, what about, since we're talking about animals and sukkah, and here they all actually have this in the park as well. What about using your animal as one of the walls for your sukkah? Can your animal be the wall? So that's actually a machloket. Again, it's a disagreement. If it's valid, again, one opinion is you can't use any living thing for the sukkah. Or for the crossbeam in Eruvin, or for pasei biraot. We're going to get to those in a minute. Just to remind you, remember our well that we talked about during the 3 festivals when people were coming to Jerusalem and they were traveling, they needed to stop on Shabbat and water their animals. Remember, the well was in the public domain. How do they give water to their animals if the well itself is a private domain? Remember, we talked about putting 4 corners. You don't have to build an entire structure, but as long as there were something on the 4 corners, that would be valid to create a private domain. So we're going to get to that in a minute, but here the Gemara says that you can't use an animal as one of those corners, which we'll get to in a second. And the Gemara also adds that you can't write a bill of divorce to a woman. You cannot write it on a living animal, on a living thing. We'll get to that also in the Gemara in a little bit. Again, so now why can we not use this animal? We're afraid that one reason is we're afraid it's going to die. If it dies, it's going to fall down and you're going to lose your wall. Another option is that it's going to run away. So then the Gemara says, oh, okay, if the problem is running away, just tie it down. So maybe if you tied it down or you tie it up, it can't run away and it can't fall down if it dies. So maybe this would be valid. And if you look, you see these little sticks between its legs. Why are those there? The Gemara says, well, there's a lot of space between its legs. So the Gemara says, oh, don't worry. You fill in the space with some sticks, and then it's seen as a solid wall, and then it would be okay. Okay. Since, again, interestingly enough, those of you who are getting into the Gemara brain, I call it, right, into the Gemara state of mind. So the Gemara says, okay, since we're talking about this animal, and one of the things we were concerned about is that it might die, let's look at other cases. Are we concerned that people might die? What's the case that the Gemara gives? A girl who is from the any tribe, meaning a Bat Yisrael. She is not a priest. She's not born in the priestly family. So she marries a Kohen, a priest, and we know that the priest is allowed to eat truma. Remember, truma being the gifts that were given to the priest. A priest or anyone in his household can eat that truma, even though it has special sanctity. Let's say he goes on a business trip. Again, in those days, they would go for many months. Again, there's no continental, transatlantic flight. They go on a boat. It takes months. Do we have to be concerned that maybe he died on the way? Can his wife still eat truma, right? Again, she can only eat it because he's alive. So are we concerned that maybe he would die? And that really is very interesting, that there's, again, a disagreement, a machloket, whether or not we're concerned, one source says we are, another one says we aren't. Again, that's very interesting. Another concern here, it's not about someone dying. Rather, we're talking at the bottom of 23 that somebody bought wine from a non-Jew. Here it says kuti. Kuti was the kutim were a group of people and a nationality that lived in Israel, and they were like supplanted into Israel, and they actually converted. The Gemara in numerous places is not sure whether they really converted or not. Meaning, did they really want to convert or not? Were they just going through the motions because they were living in Israel? And it's actually fascinating to see sometimes the Kutim are seen as non-Jews, sometimes they are seen as Jews. So here they're seen as either non-Jews or, here they're seen as Jews who don't necessarily adhere to the law. And therefore, when you buy wine from them, we are concerned that they did not separate the tithes, the trumot and maasrot, and therefore you need to separate the tithes, the gifts to the priests before you eat or drink from this food. So what happened? You bought this wine before Shabbat, and you didn't have a chance to separate the trumot and masrot before Shabbat. What do? You want to drink from this wine on Shabbat. So one option is that you're stuck and you have to wait. Another idea is you can say, okay, I'm going to drink from this wine and I'm going to separate whatever's left at the bottom, right? I'm going to leave a tenth, I'm going to leave a 50th, right? I'm going to leave those gifts at the bottom. I'm going to drink from the top. And then after Shabbat, I'm going to give the priest these gifts. That is like we're talking about what's going to happen later on, and retroactively we're going to see it as if we have separated it. This is the concept called breira. Breira, again, means that I'm going to do something that retroactively is going to determine what I wanted it to be. We actually saw this, if you remember, in Masachet Eruvin, right? If I put an Eruv, one on each side, and I haven't decided which way I want to go, right? Can I, on Shabbat, decide which one? And then that retroactively says, oh, that was the one I wanted to be valid. If you remember, we discussed whether or not that works. So here also, the Gemara tells us that there are those who say that it works, meaning I can say, oh, I'll leave the rest in the barrel, and after Shabbat, I'll give what's left to the priest. Another opinion is no. Why? Maybe that barrel is going to break over Shabbat, and now everything is going to spill on the floor. I'm not going to be able to give the priest the gifts, the trumot and masrot, and now what I drank is untithed wine. So now I'm messed up, right? So again, do we here again, are we concerned that it is going to break and spill or not? And again, that is also a disagreement, a machloket. Okay, so again, here's another case. We're now on Daf 24. Another case to remind you was, remember on Yom Kippur, we talked about giving the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, should we separate another wife for him, lest his wife die? Again, are we concerned for people dying or not? So again, this idea is a machloket. There is a discussion, a difference of opinion, and we are not sure. Again, there are two different opinions whether you can use the animal or not. Just very quickly, when we were talking about the get, the bill of divorce, that needs to be written on. Interestingly, on what, right? So here the Gemara tells us that it could be written on anything, though the Gemara says, no, it can be written on any surface as long as it's not something living, right? You cannot write it on your arm, you cannot write it on an animal, though there is an opinion that you can. So that's just an interesting idea on the get, the divorce document, and how it needs to be written on something nowadays. And in those days, they wrote it on parchment, and it's written by a scribe. So that is just very interesting. Okay, next case. Can the trees be the walls? We talked about the Sukkah being in the tree. What about the trees being walls? So the Gemara says that, again, as long as the walls can withstand normal wind. So here they drew it very nicely. Those are very thick trees. But if you think about, like, if you have some like swaying bushes in your yard, the question is, if they sway too much, it would be problematic. If they stay in, again, the Gemara says that then it would be okay. If you strengthen the branches so that they don't sway, so then it would be okay. And again, as I mentioned, you see here our well in the middle, and here it shows you different things that can be used as the diumad. Diumad is that corner bracket. So you can see it's supposed to be a wall, but it could be something solid. It could be even sticks, and it could also be a tree, right? So we see that right here. And the last thing here, again, is another review for Masechet Shabbat and Eruvin. What if I have a very big tree that droops like a weeping willow, and the branches go all the way down within 3 tfachim, again, our magic number, 3 tfachim of the ground. So then it creates its own domain, right? And we actually said that you can carry. This has nothing to do, by the way, this has nothing to do with Sukkah here. This is not a Sukkah, but it does, in terms of Shabbat, create a private domain, and you can carry in that area. Again, you might have to tie down the branches so they don't sway too much. Okay, that's it for our pictures. We still have a few more dapim to go. So let's go to, again, we're now at the top of Daf 25. And one second, sorry, that's right. If a tree were a wall, wouldn't the leaves? Yes, excellent. So Sarah just asked me if the tree, going back to this case, if you have this tree, wouldn't the leaves provide shade? Correct. There cannot be branches above the Sukkah. That's an excellent question. It would have to be that the leaves go out to another side, or maybe it would be like a cypress tree or something that doesn't have overhanging branches. Correct. You cannot have branches over the Sukkah. So excellent question. Okay. And here, the Gemara on Daf 25 goes back to the concept of Shabbat. What about, again, spending time on an elevated area, and how different areas do create their own domain. And the Gemara says that as long as it's its own domain, it is okay. Interestingly, the Gemara talks about what if you're in a field and you think about like your cornfield, right? And you harvest an area. If the remaining stalks are tall enough, 10 tfachim high. Again, the magic number for a domain is 10 tfachim. So if it's 10 tfachim high, that creates a private domain, and you would be able to carry in that area. Okay, let's go to the next Mishnah on Daf 25. Very famous concept. One who is involved in a mitzvah is exempt from doing another mitzvah, right? This is very, very famous. And we're going to learn all about that today. And the Gemara continues that if you're sick, you are exempt from being in the Sukkah, not only you, but even the people who are attending you, right? The people who are helping you, taking care of you, they are also exempt from being in the Sukkah. And if you eat, again, another important concept, if you eat in a temporary way, I'm going to call that snacking, you do not have to do that in the Sukkah. Again, the Gemara is going to explain what all of these concepts mean. Okay. Let's go to the Gemara on Daf 25. Let's talk about saying Shema. We actually learned this. Those of you who remember, this is going to be a review all the way back to Masechet Brachot. We learned about saying Kriyat Shema, right? We have an obligation to say Kriyat Shema. What if I'm involved in another mitzvah? So here the Gemara says that when you are involved in another mitzvah, right here, this is the source that it says that V'lechtecha baderech, you have to say Shema when you're on the way. You have to say Shema when you're on your own way. But if you're going to do a mitzvah, you're going to do something that God has told you to do or someone else asked you to do, then you are exempt from saying the Shema. From here, they get to the idea that a groom on his wedding night is exempt from prayers. Again, because he is involved in getting married. Okay, hold on one second. Okay, let's keep going. Again, this idea that if you're the Gemara asks, what if I'm involved in a mitzvah now? Do I have to think about the consequences for a future mitzvah? And here the idea was of when we were talking, now this goes back to Masechet Psachim, when you were going to get ready for Masechet Psachim, for Korban Pesach, for the sacrifice, you needed to be pure. Remember, in order to eat the sacrifice, you needed to be pure. What happens if somebody dies? Do I need to say, oh, no, I can't be involved in burying that person because tonight I want to eat from the Passover sacrifice? The Gemara says, no, you need to deal with the mitzvah now. If you're the only person there, you need to bury the person, and we don't worry about what's going to happen in the future. You need to deal with it. Again, remember we talked about Pesach Sheni, you get a second chance to do Pesach. Okay, next, what about again, here the Gemara talks about someone who's in mourning, where somebody died that day, a personal relative, a close relative dies that day. That person is exempt from putting on tefillin, from brachot, from saying blessings, because he's involved in his mourning. This is only for the first day. After that, after the burial, the person does need to do all other mitzvot, including Sukkah. Okay, again, the groom, and here we get into a whole discussion about the groom and his close friends and the wedding party. They are exempt from Sukkah for the 7 days of the wedding, because they're all sleeping in the same area. Again, here it's different than nowadays. Here they were all staying in one kind of complex and eating and sleeping together. And then the Gemara says, well, really, it's that they're exempt also from again that night from the prayers, from Shmona Esrei, from tefillin. But they should say Shema. Again, Shema takes a minute or two, so then it's okay to say Shema. The top of Daf 26 says that the groom is exempt from saying Shema. Again, the groom is focused on his new bride, and that's what he should be focused on, and he is exempt from all other mitzvot. Here, interestingly, the Gemara talks about other people that are exempt, people who are involved in writing a Torah scroll, a Sefer Torah, or tefillin, or a mezuzah, or anybody who sells any of these items. Again, it doesn't mean you have a big store that you sell lots of things and those are some of the things, but you are a mezuzah merchant. If you're involved in selling these sanctified objects, you are exempt from, again, prayer, from saying the Shmona Esrei, the Amidah, the silent prayer, again, saying Shema, from putting on tefillin, as long as you're involved in this mitzvah of selling these items. What if you're on a journey? So the Gemara says that if you're on a journey, you're exempt from sitting in a sukkah, but when you get to your destination, right? So if you're driving all day, so you can snack in your car, when you get to wherever you're going, you really should be in a sukkah that night to have your meal at night. The same thing for the opposite. If you're driving all night, you're exempt. In the daytime, you should really have a sukkah. The same thing with a watchman, the people who are guarding either the city or a field, the same thing. While they're on duty, they do not need to be in the sukkah. When they go home or when they leave, they do need to be in a sukkah. Let's talk about the person who is sick. The Gemara says it's not only someone who is I would say seriously ill or deathly ill, even someone who is kind of ill. I'll start with, let's say, someone who has the flu. They're just not feeling well. They're exempt from the sukkah. You don't have to be, very, very ill in order to be exempt. You can just, not feel well, maybe have a fever. But the Gemara continues and says, even if you have a headache, that is enough to exempt you from being in the sukkah. And then even if you're just, your eye is hurting you, something is hurting you, that is already called mitzta'er. Mitzta'er means you're suffering. If there's something not good, you're allowed to leave the sukkah if it's bothering you. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. So it's interesting how the Gemara kind of goes from being very sick to being a little sick to just not feeling well, a little bit. And there is a difference, right? So if you're sick, the people taking care of you are also exempt. If you're just, I don't know, my head hurts, or if it's just meets the air, you're not feeling well, you are exempt, but the people taking care of you still have an obligation to be in the sukkah. All right, from here, the Gemara talks about napping versus sleeping, and how there's a difference between napping and sleeping. Again, the Gemara says you shouldn't even nap outside of the sukkah. Again, in those days, they ate in the sukkah, they slept in the sukkah. Again, they're living again in Israel where it's warm. They're not living in Poland or Canada or Alaska. If it's cold, you do not have to be freezing in your sukkah. We will talk about at what point you can leave the sukkah. But here they say we don't want you to take a nap outside of your sukkah, lest you fall into a deep sleep, and then that would be problematic. From here, the Gemara goes into a very interesting discussion about sleeping while wearing tefillin. So just to remind us that in the time of the Mishnah, people wore tefillin the whole day, not just for the morning prayer. They would put it on in the morning, and they would have it on the whole day. If you remember when we learned Masechet Brachot, we talked about if you have to go to the bathroom, how did they do that, right? Again, because they were wearing their tefillin all day. Did they cover it? Did they take it off? That was Masechet Brachot. So here the Gemara talks about napping versus sleeping, that you could take a nap maybe with your tefillin, but you shouldn't sleep with your tefillin. So that was just an interesting discussion where we went from sukkah to tefillin. The next Mishnah on the bottom of 26 What about, so there's a story where they brought 2 dates and a pitcher of water, and they said, oh, no, 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 I don't want to eat this outside of the sukkah. Let's go to the sukkah and I'll eat it there. That's very interesting because didn't we just learn that you're allowed to snack outside of the sukkah? Again, having a drink of water, 2 dates, that's called a snack. What's going on here? The Gemara is going to explain it in a minute. Another case was that they brought a small amount of bread, less than an egg volume of bread, and he covered it with a napkin, meaning he didn't wash his hands before he ate the bread. He covered it with a napkin and ate it, and didn't say the Birkat Hamazon, the blessing afterwards. And the question is why? We'll see in a minute. So let's go to the Gemara at the very bottom of 26. The Gemara again asks, what's going on? Didn't we say that you can snack outside? The Gemara says you're right, but really here it's saying he could have eaten it outside, but he wanted to be stringent. Again, we've seen this before, that there are rabbis who want to be stringent on themselves. The Gemara says that you can be stringent on yourself and eat everything anything that you eat, you could eat it in the sukkah, and it's not seen as a sign of haughtiness. So that's just very interesting. Interesting that the Gemara is saying in general, if you're overly stringent, it's maybe seen as a sign of haughtiness. So here the Gemara says no, but it's interesting that that is even an option. The top of 27 again talks about the amount of bread that he ate and says because it was such a small amount, he was not obligated to wash beforehand or say the blessing afterwards. Now the Mishnah on 27 tells us that the first opinion is you need to eat 14 meals in your sukkah. What's 14 meals? 7 days of Sukkot. In those days, they ate 2 meals a day, so it was really like a brunch and then a dinner. So you should eat 14 meals in the sukkah. The sages say, no, you don't have to eat 14, meaning you don't have to eat 14 meals in the sukkah, but whenever you're eating a meal, you should do so in your sukkah, right? You don't have to eat if you don't want to. If you are eating, you should do so in the sukkah. Again, the first night is going to be more stringent. There's going to be a biblical obligation to eat in the sukkah. And here we're going to see that it's connected to Pesach. If you remember, we learned that there's a biblical obligation to eat matzah on the first night. Therefore, the same thing with Sukkah, there's a biblical obligation to eat in your Sukkah on the first night. Okay. Interestingly, there is an opinion. Rabbi Eliezer says that you shouldn't move from one Sukkah to another on Sukkot. Why? Because it says in the Bible, it says in the Torah, you need to sit in your Sukkah for 7 days. We understand that to mean whenever you sit and eat, you should do so in a sukkah. But it doesn't, so Rabbi Eliezer says you should do it in the same sukkah, meaning you can't go from one sukkah to another. You have to eat in the same sukkah all 7 days. The sages say no. The importance is to be in a sukkah. It doesn't have to be the same sukkah. Okay. Okay, so he says this is his opinion. You have to be in the same sukkah. So too, Rabbi Eliezer says that you can't borrow your lulav. Again, the 4 species. We're going to learn a lot about that in the following pages. Not today, but he says that the lulav needs to be your own. Right? It says that it needs to be kach lecha or lachem. It needs to be taken for yourself. Therefore, you need to own it. So he says on the first day you can't borrow from someone else. So too you can't borrow someone else's sukkah, which is very interesting. This is not the law. The law is that you can sit in someone else's sukkah. It does not have to be yours. The Gemara, the sages say, what do we learn from the idea of taking it for ourselves? It means you can't use a stolen sukkah or a stolen lulav. So that is very that is, we'll talk about more when we get later on in the Masechet. That is actually a very funny scene if anybody has seen the movie Ushpizin. So that's like a funny scene where they go to steal. You're not allowed to steal. So rule number one, no stealing sukkas and no stealing lulav and etrog. Okay. And Rabbi Eliezer says that, again, it's better you should stay home all of Sukkot. You shouldn't necessarily leave. Again, he believes you have to be in your own Sukkah the whole week. And he says that but you can visit your teacher. There's this idea that on the festivals, you would go to your teacher to learn from them. So he says you could you can go and visit your teacher. Better to do so on a day trip and then be home at night so that you can be in your own Sukkah. And here they ask, can you add to a Sukkah on Shabbat? Maybe it's hot. Can you spread like a sheet out on your Sukkah? And the answer is no. And interestingly here, Rabbi, we actually had this. It's interesting to see if you remember this, but Rabbi Eliezer doesn't give them a straight answer. He kind of gives these very evasive answers, and he explains later on that if he didn't hear something directly from his teacher, he would not teach it, meaning he didn't want to answer the question, even though he could have figured it out on his own. He didn't want to say anything from his own. He wanted to quote his teacher, and since he didn't learn it directly, he didn't want to say anything in that way. And here he compares it to shuttering the window on Shabbat, that if it's attached, you can use it. And Rabbi Eliezer says, no, again, you can't add to an ohel, to an enclosure. And just the last line on the top of 28 is that we know we don't really compare the shutter that we talked about in Masachet Shabbat in the window to Sukkah. And I just realized that at the beginning I said we're doing 21 to 28. We're doing 21 to 27. So sorry about that. So today's daf is 27. So we are going to stop here. Next week we will pick it up at daf 28. And I wish everybody a great week, and we will learn more next week. Excellent. So Lisa's asking, what about inviting guests? Excellent. Again, we do not follow Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. We follow the sage's opinion, which is that you can sit in someone else's sukkah. If in Israel, at least, in all the parks, they set up all these sukkot. So really, the idea is to sit in a sukkah. Actually, in Israel, it's interesting. I don't know if they do it in America, but they do this idea of like a sukkah hop, where the kids go from sukkah to sukkah. It's kind of like trick or treating, but in Israel for sukkot. And it's actually the opposite of what we just said, right? The goal is to go to as many sukkot as you can and sit and eat and be with friends and family. So it's interesting. Rabbi Eliezer's idea is let's focus on the family, but the sages, the Chachamim's idea is it's actually about being outdoors, right? That's going to be our dichotomy, right? The sukkah is like our house. But it is outside. So what does that mean, right? I'm kind of outside of my four walls. I invite people in, and it is a time especially to invite guests. So definitely do that. Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone.
And thank you, Rabbi. Thank you very much. Thank you.